Prince Stash is one of the key figures from the swinging 60s. He was parked there right in the middle between the Beatles and the Stones. He was best friends of Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Syd Barrett. More than that, he was a prime mover in that period and a big influence on those bands and the music and the scene that surrounded him. You're in LA, are you?
I'm in Malibu. I was never able to get to get away. They cancelled my flight which was meant. I'm normally at the castle of Monte Calvello for 6 months, nearly every year. This is the first year that I didn't. Not only didn't I go to Asia, thank God, at the end of January, but I remained stuck here until next year. Because there was just started with the cancellation of my flight, and in any case, I was thinking that it would not be a very good experience this year over there, and due to the whole social distancing, and as it turned out, none of my foreign friends have made it virtually to all the Americans who have properties over there were my friends and neighbors. They haven't been able to go at all. So, and that's what happened. So I'm here until and my wife Tan is stuck in Australia, which is amazing as well because I can't get there and she can't get here.
Yeah, I think that story sums up 2020.
Yeah, that's 2020. It's an amazing time. However, it's not, as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking this with a giant dose of philosophy and not being unduly worried. I mean, there's nothing you can do. You start getting worried and in fear and unhappy with your lot, whereas so many people across the globe have truly reasons to be unhappy. I'm in the lap of luxury in one of my own homes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at there. Is that like a shed in your garden, or is that the room in the back of the house? It's a nice looking space.
No, this is a room in the house, which is a Tibetan room, which has lots of books and so on. But originally, when I moved in, it had a very hideous color on the ceiling, and you couldn't remove it. So I had it painted over by artists who had it done as a Tibetan scheme.
Yes, it's actually, even watching it through a Zoom screen, it's very calming.
Yeah.
So, actually, what I wanted to, I mean, you've had a remarkable life, and it's like it's the most pop culture adventure story that you could possibly have. But I'm actually interested in what you're actually doing these days.
What am I doing? Well, I'm actually involved in a lot of music. I have there's several documentary projects about my life, but I was keen to emphasize that I wasn't just a dinosaur of a gone by era, and that I was very much an artist at work with different media, including playing a lot of different instruments. One of them is an electronic instrument that emulates a harpsichord of a 17th century harpsichord, a Baroque instrument. And with the tuning, it remains in this constant 4/15 tuning, which is a completely different vibe to the 4/40 tunings of modern instruments. And so I found that I could, by a mode of Ike Turner, along with Brian Jones, were great influences upon my own psychic abilities, and I had all sorts of hang-ups about things. And Ike Turner, who was a very much maligned man, was the one to persuade me to leave aside all the inner enemies that of doubt and of saying, well, one limits oneself by saying one can't do this, but instead it was an extraordinary liberation to make it your own, as Katana put it, and it went with playing guitar to playing sitar, electric sitar, and so on. And I've composed a lot of music for a psychedelic ballet about Padmasambhava, the 8th century sage who brought Buddhism to Tibet, and legendary figure. And I took years ago, I was invited by a friend of the family, Roland Béjart, the choreographer, to his dance studio in Lausanne, Switzerland. And I beheld the extraordinary beauty of a Japanese dancer, which inspired me to think in terms of how to express a story with no words, just music and movement. In other words, a kind of ballet, but a psychedelic ballet in using the inspiration of the great Japanese, very elaborate costumes of the divinities of the Tibetan pantheon, who originally were the divinities of the old bone religion, and the opposition that Padmasambhava faced was not a human one, but a supernatural agency of those primeval forces who feared being displaced of their worship on their own territory. So, as opposed to the sort of Christian type of casting demons away, and all that kind of thing, Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism in particular is very all-inclusive and made everybody, including the so-called fearful divinities, to be protectors of the truth and the dispellers of ignorance and so on. And so I contrived, I invented a form of music, the music to drive that kind of ballet would have to have been not ethnic music, because it was well pre-Tibetan civilization as we know it, so nothing of today's type of thing. So I thought, I came upon this idea of playing electric sitar with a glass slide, and came up with a very unusual sound. In fact, I have some samples and things, and that I could send you.
This sounds absolutely amazing. I really want to hear it.
And the isolated tracks, I still have to. I've now found the percussion tracks that need to go with those tracks. I've got many hours of all that stuff, and I need to marry of the percussive thing that drives the dancing and so on, and it's got to be this whole languorous sort of thing. And then a friend of mine, Lee J. McCloskey, was a famous sort of matinee idol, among other things. He was a big star on Dallas, and absurdly good-looking fellow, who was in fact the son of a painter and a very good artist in his own right. And he calls himself a visual philosopher, and his entire the scope of his own artwork. He created an art piece, which is an ongoing thing, using an entire studio with all the furnitures, all the books, everything are painted in this extraordinary theme. It makes a vision instrument of incredible power and magnitude. And in fact, he never planned it like that. But if you put on 3D glasses, the whole thing comes, it's just amazing because it just happened that way, And so he painted one of his last easel paintings was a very beautiful painting called Phoenix Arise. And this painting was reproduced on invitation cards to an exhibition. And those cards, there were there were stacks of them. And one of these stacks fell to the ground and a little girl rearranged them. And it turned out that they produced these mandalas. At any rate, it's incredibly curious, and you'd have to see a demonstration of this thing to, it's stranger than fiction, because each of these elements created an extraordinary story and created these mandalas, which went from being small ones to being huge things, and I'm using his patterns to develop the psychedelic ballet, and using contortionists, to open as flowers in a mandala and so on. And we were faced with production difficulties originally I wanted to stage this a la Zhang Jinmu, the director, the Chinese director. And I was very keen to do this in China, but there were all kinds of restrictions and difficulties and so on and so forth. And only recently, relatively recently, within the last 3 months or so, somebody pointed out that in a documentary about me, they would animate things. And it occurred to me that I could animate all these ideas and create an animated sort of 3D piece of this entire idea using the music and everything else. And it would be a much more literally palatable type of product to offer, because it could be made, especially in this day and age, with all the restrictions on shooting, etc., that occur nowadays. So as you see, I'm involved in a lot of things, and I improvise on this electronic device. For it's like a meditation. You just sit there and let the without deliberately thinking about it, very harmonious compositions come out. And it's a tradition in what is called intuitive music, which I have a friend who was a famous Russian concert pianist who was overcome by the whole incredible sort of difficulties with her own husband, who was a Svengali, etc. And she drifted into a completely different field, but returned to music via this form of intuitive, liberating form, which she said as a highly trained from childhood concert pianist, it was very difficult for her to break through. But me, I had been playing with the piano as a child, for instance, and been submitted to extraordinary kind of abuse that children of my generation were submitted to sometimes in the 40s. And that's what happened, steel rulers were that, you had to do things a certain way, and I revolted against it, never wanted to do it again for decades. And I found it incredibly liberating. And there's the precedent of Chopin saying that he would improvise things and come up with extraordinary things that he couldn't recreate afterwards. He didn't know how he'd come up with them, and spent hours in trying to reclaim them, because of course he couldn't record himself. Whereas I've been recording, I recorded with this extraordinary Italian engineer, was trained in England and worked in Holland. A man nicknamed Albino Frank, who's a real one of those sound freaks, who had mics everywhere, and in a room of the castle in Italy, which has extraordinary 16th century frescoes of the games of the children. There's great acoustics, and one of those instruments is placed there. And those things are very kind of entry-level, almost a child's toy, but they have these voices that, tens of thousands of, I've tried, to find an equivalent in extremely expensive machines that do not have them. And so the challenge you're faced with is, how do you bypass the stupid Mickey Mouse electronics on the thing but if you are able to go from an earphone jack into a system, then you can get amazing sound. It's incredible. You bypass the whole limitations of the thing. Yeah. And that's what we did. And I've got the beginnings of an album, and I'm working on the rest of it. Unfortunately, a man that I just met, a very old and brilliant man, is in dire straits health-wise. And otherwise, my whole home studio here would be already ready.
I need to introduce you to this guy in England called Youth. This journey now, you seem to be in a very spiritual, very musical place. Do you think your whole of your life has been a kind of a journey seeking that kind of spirituality?
Well, it's let's say it's not new age type of stuff. I was during the psychedelic times, which for me began in 1965 when I was turned on to acid for the first time by Christopher Jones, the actor who had a very bizarre career marred by an extraordinary incident that I was a part of, involving Sharon Tate and other people, and a magic sort of operation. Christopher Jones had turned Bobby Woodman Clarke, the extraordinary drummer who was perhaps the first English rock drummer to play with double bass drums, and who played with everybody in early British rock, and who was greatly admired by figures such as Charlie Watts and Ringo Starr and so on. He was the drummer in the band that I used to play with, Vince Taylor, the legendary Vince Taylor of Brand New Cadillac fame.
Absolutely.
And Vince Taylor was a very close friend of mine from 1961 onwards. And when I returned from California at the end of 63, by 1964, I was looking in Europe in vain for the kind of jobs I had been hoping to get in cinema and or in theater. And he, seeing my frustration, said, well, you've always been into the music. Why don't you join the band? So I joined Vince Taylor's band, and we did that we did a couple of tours, including this incredibly exciting and successful tour of Spain, at the very, very beginning of the long-haired craze and all that, which was amazingly well received and landed us not on an opening slot for the Rolling Stones at the Paris Olympia, but being in a sort of battle of the bands. We were like, there were 10 other acts on the bill, that mostly played one song, two, and in the case of Rocky Roberts and the Airedales, they played three songs. Then there was a magician, and we came on, did our full set, which in those days was 20 minutes, and then there was an intermission. Then the Stones came on, they played 20 minutes, and that was the end of it. And and we did that over the entire Easter weekend of 1965. That's the origin of my becoming close friends with Brian Jones, introducing Brian, in fact, to Anita Pallenburg, who never credited that time as her having met, because at the time Brian Jones was with Zuzu, another girl who became quite famous as a singer and so on, who was a model. And so she only hooked up with him much later on in the year in Munich. So her story has always been skewed to ignoring the fact that at the time she was one of my many casual girlfriends, and one was very free in those days and didn't have, one ran a veritable harem of girls, and without any jealousy or compunction. We just had these crazy ideas. And it's rather amazing to be approaching, in a couple of months, I'll be 78, and I'm approaching, it was those times when I was 22 and Brian had just turned 23. I would only turn 23 in October. We were born the same year, 1942. And we both had this defiant attitude that we wouldn't even reach 25. That was the whole spirit of those times. So anyway, what I was saying about the whole so-called spiritual side of things was that I was taken beyond mere worldly ambition into a realm inspired by a lot of metaphysical ambitions. And in 1967, there was this whole thing, this whole drama with the establishment attempting to decapitate the Rolling Stones. They'd already netted Mick and Keith and were prosecuting them when they arrested Brian and I, in the hopes of that way putting everybody to jail and getting rid of the Rolling Stones perceived to be a menace to society. And it sort of backfired on them. Unfortunately, Brian Jones was brainwashed by his legal team and by his own sort of guilt towards his family, his parents, and so on, and his own paranoia, fanned by the misuse of dreadful type of, Mandrax, the Mankees that were used in England in those days, which was a disastrous chemical combination, especially in conjunction with alcohol. So Brian, kind of, much to everyone's horror and shock, he became more and more alienated and went steadily to pieces. And, and people, the fans will object, well, he still, he did things like No Expectations, that marvelous slide bit. Yes, just like a dying fire, that has these returns of flame. And for a long time, he had the capacity to return, but he alienation, kind of irrational, he became totally unreliable as well, and musically unreliable. So it became a great difficulty because he was such a strong part of the band. And despite all accounts to the contrary, he wasn't really set upon and all that until there was a great deal of resentment to what he was allowing himself to wallow into, and nobody knew how to help him. Remember that in those days, people were had their own troubles, and everybody was extremely young, and nobody knew how to, even today, people haven't been able to prevent stars like Amy Winehouse or Prince and Tom Petty from, drifting into terrible stuff and dying off. So, what we're, there's this incredible fandom that invents the whole mythology of and wants to see their hero as a martyr, which is a shameful thing when Brian Jones was such an extraordinary human being and such an extraordinary musical genius in his own right. To reduce him to being some sort of sacrificial lamb is shameful, I think. And I've tried to express this in repeated interviews in my contributions to the Michael Cooper book. I don't know if you've seen that, Butterfly in the Park. And, try and get some semblance of obviously some semblance, because how do you convey except by analogy and correspondence what somebody was like, and the wealth of the texture of their being and of their vibrations and of their entire, whether Brian said things or sat there silent or played an instrument, he was a symphony in many, many hued colors. He was just such a lovely character. That's why we all, to this day, I feel tremendously sad to see, and I'm glad in a way that he, his physical health was giving in. So in a sense, it would be extremely selfish to have wished that he could have lived on, because I don't think he was in any shape to face the rest of things, and he's better off in another world, as in another dimension of being. In fact, oddly enough, I don't think the dead are completely vanished from our world. I think there's emanations coming from the world of spirits, as it were. Without indulging in any kind of religious thoughts. At any rate, for my own part, in '68, very much shaken by all these things, I had talked a great deal to George Harrison, to many different people. I had sent a letter to this. I'd heard of this spiritual master in India, and written to the latter, and he sent me an invitation, said, "Come to see me at once." So in early '68, well, this was late '67, the consequences of all those things were that by early 1968, I embarked on this journey to the East, a la Hermann Hesse, fanned by the flames of having read a book by Lama Anagarika Govinda called The Way of the White Clouds. And I really wanted, rather than do I could have signed on to be the lead singer of this band and, gone on tour and signed a major deal and all these different things. And that's not and I was engaged to Romina Power at the time. And, I had to break those chains of love and all that and attachment and decide, no, what I want to do is go the way of the white clouds. And that led in a very circuitous way to my being brought face to face with Lama Anagarika Govinda at his ashram in the Kumaon Himalayas of India, and becoming his his unique student in Tibetology and so on. And, I was very naive in those days, but I learned a tremendous amount from this gentle teachings of Lama Govinda. And from that moment on, when after many months I returned to the West with one ambition in these matters, which was to get into a study of something that I'd always been interested in all my life, but very much under a bushel, which was alchemy. And I wanted to publish a book about a manuscript which is held in the British Library, which at the time was at the British Museum, and called Splendor Solis. And the 1582 edition, not an edition, an actual beautiful illuminated manuscript, which is the best of a whole series of them across Europe. I met the keeper of manuscripts at the time, Derek Turner, who in turn sent me to Thames and Hudson, and that's how I ended up. They invited me to do a book for their Art and Imagination series, which was on alchemy, which led me to travel all over Europe in all these research libraries, including the Vatican. And then they commissioned a book on hermetic engravings in alchemical literature of the 17th century, which became my golden game. And the golden game is a great classic to this day and sells for hundreds of dollars because it's invariably out of print and the rest of it. And I did two versions of those books. I did one in English first, and then I rewrote the whole thing in French for both of these volumes, Alchemy, The Secret Art, and The Golden Game. I did French versions after the fact, and I met very interesting people, key figures of the modern alchemical traditional movement, like such as Eugène Cancelier, who was Fulcanelli's single disciple, and so on. So, that was a side of my activities which I never, ever proclaimed or was ever talking about, because it was something that I didn't want to have to discuss with people. And so I wore defiantly instead the mask of the Playboy Prince. And, and preferred to be seen as a mindless playboy than to have to engage into tiresome conversations with people who didn't have a clue about these matters.
So do you see, getting into rock and roll, Elvis, when you were at school in Geneva, playing with...
No, I got into Elvis. Yeah, I got into Elvis initially when I was in Switzerland, and then I got into it even more when I was studying in England, in Devonshire. Yeah. Oh, you've read all that, have you?
Oh, yeah, I did my research. Yeah, of course.
Right.
But do you see that as a lineage, from that, it's on one level, yeah, it's people see it's only rock and roll, but it's a door opener, isn't it? From Elvis to Alchemy, there is a lineage there. There is a journey. There is a road that sort of almost joins together.
Yes, it was. But remember that Elvis's roots was a white man delving deeply into black roots and making them his own, and to some extent giving credit for it as opposed to and doing it well, a little bit like the Rolling Stones did with R&B. He wasn't a dreadful figure like Pat Boone, who edulcorated things like all these songs that people, Little Richard or something, would come up with something, and Pat Boone would come with this milk toast type of stuff, which was hardly music at all. and so, a consciousness of the blues and of R&B especially was born, and whilst I loved rock and roll, I also was thrilled to the sounds of, as I discovered them, the likes of Muddy Waters and Jimmy Reed and so on. It became a major musical form for me. And then I thought that the Rolling Stones in their early work were to be commended for having not really covered those things, but they made those hits, those obscure to the British public and to the American white public. They took these and they covered these things, adding an extraordinarily poignant dimension to them, and made them at times better the originals, which was quite remarkable. In fact, when I worked with our mutual friends, the Dirty Strangers, I tried to emulate that kind of quality because, of Keith's association with the Dirty Strangers at the time. And I wanted to use that kind of raw energy, which they could easily, in the first recording, have drifted more to a kind of punk, less in less soulful type of thing. To my mind, the first record that we did together had some of these elements. In fact, it slightly backfired in the eyes of some people who thought that poor Alan was trying to imitate Mick Jagger. It was strictly my fault, if anybody's.
So with the blues, it was like you find a culture beyond the culture you've grown up with. There's something there, something more magical, deeper, older culture. The blues goes back and back and back, doesn't it? All the way back to Africa.
Yeah. Absolutely, to African. And I was always, when I went to, the Stones were doing a goat's head soup in Jamaica, and I went to stay with them. I stayed with Keith, and then from there I went on an extensive journey into Haiti and into the whole Haitian scene, which was under Baby Doc Duvalier. And I was extremely well received by a much, regardless of what their social crimes against their own people, at the time, Haiti presented a much better picture than it did after so many revolutions and so many things. After all that supposedly goodwill, things got rather worse than better. And when I traveled right through the island, I met so many people of all classes and had a very, very positive experience. And also musically, I was fascinated by the tradition of what is called the petro drums, and this whole voodoo thing that came from Benin, and it's a dimension that was an inspiration to what I wanted to do rhythmically with the project we talked about earlier.
Were you always sensitive to all this other cultural stuff? The beyonds, instead of the very straight white European culture. Is it you personally, or is it because partly your background with your father being famous painter. Was that?
Yeah, but it was very much things that you came upon on your own. Jazz and the likes were not really encouraged in the family. My aunt was an opera singer. The house where one of the mansions that I grew up in, Fontenay, which is now was a vast estate, which is now a whole area of Geneva is built upon it. That whole area, that whole era, there were balls, there were great concerts, classical concerts. Even Paderewski, came and played there, and so on. And I was far, in a way, although very much aware of the classics and classical music, I was much more attracted to an African beat than to, what really made my heart beat was at first rock and roll, but then it was, what its derivations from African music. And so on. Mm-hmm. So, my own, although I am fascinated by, as I say, part of the musical trajectory that I find myself in is also to explore the counterpoint harmonies that you can come up with on improvising upon certain in a certain mode.
Almost like a painter, but with sound.
Sorry?
Almost like you're painting with sound. You talk about music in terms of texture. And
yes, absolutely. Painting with sound, very much so.
And do you think this is something that's in your DNA, maybe?
Probably. My grandfather was a painter. My grandmother was a painter of immense talent. I mean, if you've seen her portraits of Rainer Maria Rilke, whose lover she was, and so on, it's an amazing. She was an extraordinary. So my father got it from both his parents.
So when you're sort of playing with Vince Taylor, which is, and I love Vince Taylor, I think he's fantastic, and it's very simple rock and roll, but you're still, to you, was that still playing something that was expansive as the paintings of your family?
Yes, but perhaps under my influence, Vince became enamored also of what was happening in England. For instance, he was physically, as we started to play together, he abandoned the black leather rocker image to embrace a more mod, albeit extreme mod image, which was inspired by PJ Proby's looks and so on, and then Vince, we started to write, in a completely different idiom from what he had become famous for. And it would, if he hadn't flipped out on that, we might have been able to do to go much further. And it's unfortunate that we weren't able to do had an extremely well financed foray into America planned, and it just happened that he fell to pieces, having gone to England and taken some unfortunate substances, and then he was somebody who was always a bit on the edge of sanity anyway, and it just pushed him over the edge, and after that, for the rest of his life, he only recovered partially, but a part of himself was shattered in that psychedelic experience of 1965.
I mean, he must be one of the earliest acid casualties, mustn't he, in pop culture?
He was an acid casualty, but not only that, he compounded the disaster by taking a lot of speed and drinking tons and tons of bad wine on top of it, and that was, and then not sleeping, etc. Because my intuition when Vince came back all flipped out and everything was, we have to get him into the American hospital in Paris and get him into a sleep cure, because that might snap him out of it, but you'd have to sleep for, be induced in a almost induced coma for 5 days or so, and then he might recover something that had been, but with rest and therapy and the rest of it, he might have returned to some, well, I don't know if these things can be termed in those ways, return to his senses. I put all this in quote marks because you never know what is going on.
It's interesting you talk about a more expansive musical journey that you were talking about with him. And as much as I love his records, I find it very hard to imagine him being able to make a jump into a different musical era. I mean, what was he much more of an artful character than he seems? He's a fantastic frontman and a great rock and roll singer. But it was
he was an amazing showman, but he had fabulous ideas. Even when he flipped out, I was so enraged with him that I tore, with his elucubrations and so on, that I tore up a sheet of paper on which he'd written like a sort of prophetic type. His amazing hallucinated mind had come up with the names of bands who didn't exist yet, like Big Brother and the Holding Company. I thought, what rubbish, tear it up. What the hell? And these bands came into being, on that, this whole thing, Big Brother and the Holding Company in 1965. What rubbish can you be talking about, And he had, that's the fine line between genius and madness.
He didn't have Ziggy Stardust written down there, did he?
What?
Ziggy Stardust.
Well, Ziggy Stardust was like when Vince had, in the aftermath of that Parisian flip out, I was meant to go to Hollywood with 3 members. We were then a trio with unfortunately, both of these fellows have departed this plane of existence. One was Bobby Clarke, and the one who died earlier, well, he died late last year, was Ralph Danks, who had become a very famous figure in Japan, a sort of artist, guru, etc., and musician. And we all went to California, and that's when I was offered to be by Bob Rafelson and Bert Snyder to be in the Monkees, and which had been a promising project until I read this very bland outline pilot script, which was, after all the build-up that I'd been given, was a terrible letdown.
So what was the original idea then? Was it?
The original idea, what their slogan was, that it would be Hard Day's Night every week. But Hard Day's Night had, still to this day you can enjoy Hard Day's Night. It has an immediacy, a sort of lovely style, which, the Monkees were never able to even be a pale copy of. It was a lousy sort of, it was awful. I still remember some of the lines, which I thought, I was into being super cool and hip and had done, this amazing thing with Jodorowsky Alejandro Jodorowsky, Topor, and Arrabal, which, had contributed to stylistic ideas to these pieces and so on, to this extraordinary happening of which fragments have remain that have been filmed by Ina. And, I was into real sort of avant-garde sort of things. And it seemed to me, remember, I was not even 23 at the time. And it seemed, to sign a contract for 2 years over a thing that I doubted would even get on the air seemed like a bad career move. Mm. And so I preferred to do things differently. And, and in the end, I was proven correct, although there was a brief period of doubt when the Monkees became incredibly successful. But, it was not, they never got much out of it anyway.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting to talk about the Monkees, straight 60s pop, pastiche. But what was remarkable about the Beatles and the Stones, two biggest bands in the world, is this confluence between pop culture, pop music, and the avant-garde, and loads of ideas. And you're in the middle of all this. And is that definitely the atmosphere and the conversations that were going on at that time?
Yes, but people always think that one was about, they seem to throw upon the so-called scene an intellectual veneer that it definitely was not. It had, give you an example. Jimi Hendrix. I was introduced to Jimi Hendrix by Brian Jones. We took to each other like ducks to water. We just adored each other and all that. And being at Jimi Hendrix's apartment for when they had just received the acetates for Are You Experience, the whole Jimi experience, all these musicians were there, all of us, many of us were there, and tons of girls lined the, floor to ceiling, lovely girls. And all night long, those acetates were played over and over again because it was as much a thrill for those who had played on the record to listen to themselves on vinyl, what would become vinyl later on, but to listen to the recorded product as it was for us to discover them. Then interviewers came along and said, well, what did you think? And, what did Brian think and all that? I said, think? What do you mean think? It wasn't about thinking. It was about this amazing feeling that just linked all of us into this unity of joy, of sheer joy, this magnificent feeling, which can only be expressed possibly as wow, not about, oh my God, or this and that. It seemed ludicrous to intellectualize about that kind of raw visceral experience of that kind of extraordinary music, because Jimi Hendrix was a distillation of all kinds of things, had been with the Isley Brothers, had been with Ike Turner. Ike told me I fired him because, he kept messing around with all these effects. And, you in Ike's band, you had to play precise things. And Jimmy was always straying into other stuff and so on. He'd been on the Chitlin circuit. He was a complete bluesman, and yet he totally took these things to a completely different dimension. And as a human being, Jimi Hendrix was the kindest, most polite person I've ever met in my life. He was so polite and gentle and kind, in fact, that you thought he was putting you on. You looked at him with suspicion when you first met him. So is he taking the piss or what? Because he would say things like, "Would you care to take a seat?" And you'd say, "Yeah, what do you mean?" He was such an extraordinary person, Jimi Hendrix, so generous of his being, so especially in the beginnings, 1967, he played the Roundhouse. I didn't have a ticket, but I was in my limo and in all my finery and with a driver, kind of bruiser type with a crew cut and a suit. And we drove up to the Roundhouse, and I told the driver, "Brian, you go out and tell them that Prince Stash is here." And much to my amazement, a few minutes later, Brian returns, escorting Jimi Hendrix himself in all his stage finery, who gets me out of the car. "Please come with me," and took me. And, I was an honored guest. And it was just such generosity.
When you talk about the finery, I think that's fantastic as well, because the people looked like the music. I'm sure I read a quote of you somewhere that you were an art form, the way you dressed, the way you were. It was like a piece of art.
Yeah. It was an amazing, this inventiveness. And if you've seen, that I did an interview for Rave magazine in '66, where I mentioned that the philosophy that became Brian Jones and I, how do you avoid getting things that other people can get off the rack? So we put together outfits as opposed to, we found special pieces that you could assort with other things. And then we went further and further into a kind of unisex splendor with, going to buying secondhand girls' dresses and things and cutting them into tunics and things to give this kind of feel to things, and wore layers and made it was this whole sense of how can you break these boundaries, especially since it was very much I did an interview the other day where somebody asked me, "When you talk about the straights, you don't mean sexually?" I said, no, to us, everybody else was a square, if you will. We were the hip ones, and they hated us so much because they resented the way we looked, since we appealed to the women folk and the rest of it. And so the style was as much a reaction against the bowler-hatted brigade. They hated us. They thought we were a menace to our looks and everything. Were a menace to society. And indeed, as I've often said, in '65, I came back from America, and the people at customs started to say, in Switzerland, flying in from New York, they said, "Well, why don't they get all these guys, meaning the long-haired weirdos, and send them all to Vietnam?" Basically, the implication was to get killed. And in fact, to underline the point, one irate customs officer turned to the other and he pointed at me and said, "If my son looked like that, I'd kill him with my own hands." I mean, and with this heartfelt ire, this incredible anger, and then you would see the whole street freeze frame for what the hell? Why was it so strange? Why had the world gone into such a bland kind of suit and tie type of scene? And in England, the establishment was all these bowler-hatted, umbrella-carrying brigade. And when we were busted with Brian, the my own attorney was so trying to shame me and saying, "But you, sir, are a gentleman. What on earth are you doing with those chaps?" He spat the word about the Rolling Stones, unspeakable, untouchable sort of thing, and then tried to imply, "Oh, you're taking drugs because you come from a broken home," sort of thing. Anyway, basically, not even bothering to defend us against charges we were clearly innocent of. It was decided both by Brian's legal team and my legal team that we were guilty, so they would defend us, but they consider us guilty anyway. We were drug taking weirdos, That was it.
And so the whole style, was it? I mean, it's a style you're pushing against the boundaries, like you're saying, but also it is an encapsulation of the music and the culture as well. It's colourful, but it's dandy, but it's Regency. It's very classic, and in a way,
it actually is much more. There's a style error in those commentaries. Dandyism, as defined very well by Barbet d'Aurevilly, Beau Brummel, and all that, was about perfection in style, but that was meant to be so perfect that it was to be inconspicuous. It was conspicuous only in its innate perfection. It wasn't the kind of flamboyance that we were more like fops, or more accurately, like in the Directoire period that followed the revolutionary period and preceded the First Empire in France. There was a group of people called Les Incroyables, the incredible ones. And the incredible ones were the ones who pioneered the styles that we wore. It would be more the real. If you look at the history of costume and our own extravagances in that kind of way, was far closer to descend from Les Incroyables than from the dandies. Now people don't know what dandies are, so they call us dandies, but we certainly weren't dandies in my eyes. We were more Les Incroyables with our hairdos and our bizarre things, and we towards the late 60s, we went into greater and greater extravagances. I started to wear Arab robes, Syrian wedding dresses, crowns of silver, extremely long hair, and all sorts of bizarre sort of stuff. More and more defiant in styles than a year or two earlier.
It's interesting because you grew up in the house where Lord Byron on the famous weekend was at. Was Byron in here somewhere? Because of course, Mad, Bad and Dangerous.
Yes, well, if you look, there's that magazine, New Man. I don't know if you've seen that one. I did an interview for them once, which came out at the time of exhibitionism in England. And they've rephotographed a picture of myself at a costume ball in 1953. It was in the summer, so I was still 10 years old, and I wore this sort of top hat, satin and, lace and ruffles and so on type of look. And I was extremely comfortable in that. And in 1961, I was in a film by Marc Allégret called Le Démon de Minuit, The Midnight Demon, which was, and I was like the prototype extravagant fashion photographer that David Hemmings would later portray in Blow Up. But I portrayed this photographer as dressed with capes and this whole flowing extravagant garb, and in every scene I had a different extravagant costume that sharply contrasted with everybody's styles at that time. So, it was sort of an innate idea to do something in costumes and so on, and looks that would stand out like that as a rebellion against the conformity of those times.
So in that period, the classic period, the year 65, 68, 69 period, the 60s, what was your role there? Because, in the band, it's almost like, in a sense, there's no ringleader, but you're a big influence on these people.
Yeah, there was a very funny article.
Yeah.
Paul McCartney had a butler. This butler signed some sort of confidentiality agreement, which he broke to a European publication. And suddenly we found this, my father's butler found himself on a bus, and he saw somebody reading this magazine, and peering over the guy's shoulder, he saw a picture of me. So he asked to see what it was, and then bought a copy and brought it to me. And I called the Beatles office, and in that article, they had a picture of me, and they said that with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the Il Capo del Clan, the head of the clan, just like in the Frank Sinatra, clan, I was the clan Il Capo del Clan. This was became one of my nicknames with Keith and Mick and everybody, because it was ludicrous to think that anybody could be a leader of any kind. But of course, we all influenced one another. Mm. And I started out, remember that I started out as this eccentric musician in Vince Taylor's band at a time when it was no longer Vince Taylor and the Playboys, but it was this new style of Vince Taylor. And I myself had the long hair, the glitter, the bare feet like Sandy Shaw, and this whole glamour type of the whole glam scene, I had a friend who was this very beautiful stripper, and she was using glitter in her act. I'd never seen it. And she said, oh yeah, you could use that on stage, and especially with, we wore makeup in those days. So the glitter would stick to your makeup and you would put it all over the place. And so it had, in days which were so devoid of multimedia, so remember that people listened to the radio, listened to records. There was virtually very little TV. There were no videos, no phones, nothing of that kind. So you weren't bombarded with imagery constantly. So the visual imagery caused such sensation and also such consternation, because whatever you invented would people were struck with all wonder, fear and loathing, and the rest of it. You evoked all these sensations, which nowadays, daily you see people with piercings and green and purple hair and all that go around unmolested. But we pioneered all that stuff at a time when people wanted to beat you up for the way you look.
So of all that circle of people.
But so what I was saying was that I had been, I started out as a musician, in that period. And therefore, when I went to England, it was as somebody trying to piece together a solo career and trying to find the right material to record and the rest of it. And it was as a peer, people were looking for things for me to do, and later the Beatles gave me hard days. It was chosen that Day in the Life might be before Sgt. Pepper was released. They deemed that I should do Day in the Life as a solo single, because whenever this was a tradition, you could get a hit and it would generate income and all that, which was very much needed since I was suddenly bereft of my passport, which the police had confiscated. And thanks to Paul McCartney and the Beatles in general, I was suddenly supported by these people because I had no way to turn to my own family and could not report for work in Hollywood. So it was a tragic, an exalting yet tragic moment in my life where who knew what if I would end up in jail. Which was also subject of great jokes with Roger Daltrey. Roger would say, I've had a previous and I can tell you what it's like. You get up, you clean your cell and all that. I was so horrified. He was teasing me mercilessly about this.
How far down the line?
What?
With their Day in the Life, was that just a suggested idea, or was it sketched out?
We started doing stuff. I did a number of things with the Beatles. Paul was, and I had recorded this record that was described in rave as having been a flop. In fact, it was never released, which was very unfair. But Paul McCartney persuaded this guy, this producer, to actually hand over the masters because they were doing the backup vocals on We Love You and Dandelion, and we're going to use this session at Olympic to work on my stuff. And I remember that the session ran into overtime and it got very late, and Paul said, well, we'll get, don't worry, you need to go home and you've got an early plane in the morning, so we'll take it from there. And Mick Jagger said, yeah, I'll handle it. He took these masters and stumbled and dropped them onto the ground. They fell, and I went, oh, this is a bad omen. And indeed, a whole lot disappeared, never to this day to be found again.
Oh, God.
We lost all this stuff.
Yeah.
It disappeared somewhere, never to be found again. And so that was a bit of a setback, unfortunately. But I still credit Paul and the Beatles for incredible, wonderful, people. I've had these sort of friends from the pop world, like Paul McCartney, Brian, the Stones, the Beatles, everybody in the Beatles, and Keith Moon, who in 1973, Keith Moon actually met me, and I was, I'd just been busted with Keith in this ridiculous, whole contrived sort of thing. We were denounced by a jealous boyfriend of some girl, and the police came, this corrupt drug squad people, they came and arrested us. And I run into Keith Moon, and I've got this hopeless Jamaican attorney who can't get anything. And Keith says, let me take you to Oscar Buselink, who got me off the manslaughter charges, when he was accused of having killed his own driver. And he takes me there, and Oscar Buselink takes up my case, and Richard Ducan was my, also represented me in court, and my QC. And so they get me off, and with some trepidation later on, having gotten off these charges and being totally acquitted and everything, I go and see Oscar Buselink, thinking, oh God, how much is this going to cost me then? And Oscar Buselink says, no, Mr. Moon has taken care of it all. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
He never said anything about it. He just took care of it. And when I went practically with tears in my eyes to thank Keith Moon, he said, I love you, and I want my friends to have anything that I have. It should be. He had that kind of generosity, because Keith Moon is always portrayed as just a raving lunatic, Moon the Loon, but he was just one of the most sensitive and generous people and he's never given credit for that very hidden aspect of himself.
So, out of all that circle of people, who's the person you were closest to?
Sorry?
Out of all that circle of that period, who would be the person you were closest to? Would it be Brian Jones, or would it be...
Brian Jones, but after that, by extension, it extended to the rest of the Stones, especially to Keith and Mick, and also to once I went to live at Paul McCartney's house, then George Harrison, Paul, John Lennon, I was very close to, etc. And then I was also close to people, to strange figures like PJ Proby, and then in the Who, I was always treated extremely generously by, of course, Keith Moon in the first place, by Roger, and by Pete. John Entwistle, I knew less, but I got to, later on in life, when I did the Dirty Strangers album, in the middle of it, Alan Rogan, do you know who Alan Rogan was? Mm-hmm. Alan Rogan showed up at my rented apartment in Kensington Gardens, and I had the money in my pocket to pay the studio in cash. And he was loading these two guitars into his van. I said, what are these? And he said, oh, wish I had the money, because John Entwistle is selling these. And they're such amazing pieces. And I said, show me. And it was this extremely rare, was already an antique when John had bought it in a Hollywood music shop on probably the Who's first tour. And it was a Les Paul, one of the earliest ones known, with the number 112 stamped right on the stock, and then a solid rosewood Telecaster, Fender Telecaster, which in those days was not in production. There was just a few prototypes, like the one that George Harrison played in on the Roof concert, the Apple Roof concert. And those two guitars I bought for 3,000 quid at the time, paid in cash. I'll take them. And I still have them. They're in Italy. And it's one of those great acquisitions. And it's so I always doff my hat to the memory of Alan Rogan, who was a great friend of Alan Clayton's, and so on, and Keith and I evoked his memory at the 25th anniversary of his son's wedding to my brother's niece.
Mm. So were you and Brian Jones quite similar characters? You talk about the style, the way you dressed, and the
we were. I wouldn't say we were similar. We were very different, but we harmonized extremely well. We never had a crossword, although we chased the same girls, and it was very incestuous. And there was never any jealousy on either of us, and we just adored each other. And so I was all the more affected, by his later decline. Let's put it mildly, his decline. But it was so horrifying. I can't repeat enough how distressing it was.
I mean, so what the if you weren't similar characters, what were the differences? What made you different as people?
He was much more of a. I wasn't. Brian could very easily drift into moods of introversion, perhaps paranoia, thinking, but paranoia. He wasn't paranoid in the sense that he was convinced that everybody was out to get him. That's a false notion of that. He was much more worried that people might be, some people, a girl who looked very pale might be some sort of ghoul. He was afraid. Brian had a constant fear of getting the horrors. So if he asked Maharishi when he met him, if in doing transcendental meditation you could get the horrors, as he put it. But he had. I was far more extroverted, and although with girls he was fine. It was maybe perhaps with men he was a little more reticent.
Mm-hmm. And was he as amazingly talented as people say? He could just pick up any instrument.
Exactly. He had this ability to pick up an instrument, assess what it could do, and immediately intuit a way to put it to good use. His the reverse side of the coin was that he would get easily, because he had this extraordinary facility, he would pick up things and drop them as quickly because he was sort of bored with them. He didn't develop them, although he had he came up with things that great masters couldn't have come up with. In the case of the sitar that he played on Painted Black, I always maintain that no great sitar master would have come up with that because the approach is radically different. Brian had the genius to intuit how to do that and how the instrument functioned and how, but he wasn't like George Harrison, who then went and studied the instrument and perfected it, although it takes years and years of doing nothing else. But Brian, the marimbas were left in the studio. He picked it up and he came up with this great thing of Under by Thumb. He also had an acuity of hearing which was so precise that in Lady Jane, he wanted to redo a take that to me seemed perfect. I was in the studio with him and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I've got to do this over again because why? Because it was a quarter of a tone off." He had this sort of real precision. And that's why, when he played guitar, he had this impeccable timing, this amazing rhythmic quality, which makes it all the more heartbreaking when you read of John Mayall's visit to Crotchfield Farm, where he ends up trying to jam with Brian, and Brian's lost the timing. Through these substances have eroded that key piece of his playing. It might have been a temporary effect, but it was all the more distressing. And Brian was, with celebrities, there's always doctors who overprescribe and indulge in people. It's always happened. It happens. It happened recently and so on with people, but it happened in this case. There was a doctor that we all knew very well, who was a great friend, and he, Brian would badger him for prescriptions for these black bombers and all that type of thing, and he shouldn't have been given any of that stuff if he was to restore. He had, when he died, apart from the pain of losing Brian, there was this appalling realization of how much damage he'd done to his body, with these dreadful. They released these autopsy records that said that his, heart had, all this fat, and the heart had, was and so huge, and the liver was all damaged, and and I was so horrified, absolutely horrified. And to this day, every time they bring up the subject of Brian's death, I get extremely depressed by the decay, that it took place in such few years, relatively speaking.
So, again, talk about his musical talent. What he did to these Stone songs, and we'll talk about this earlier in the interview. He was like a painter.
What he did was he contributed to those songs and made them totally immortal. That's for sure.
He added the magic dust, the extra colors that made them.
Yes, but it's more than just color. Somehow it was like an alchemical transmutation of something that was good, great, perhaps, but he made it exceptional. I mean, those great hits that he played on, to some people, everything, the diehard fans argue that nothing was, which I don't subscribe to. I don't think it's true that it was the best work they ever did, but it certainly was immortal work.
When you talk about people like burned out in the 60s, you knew Syd Barrett very well as well. And
I didn't know him, correction, I didn't know him very well. I got to know him very well because we spent that transition 67 to 68 was spent, am I saying this right? Yes, 67 to 68, we were at a house owned by the management of Pink Floyd in the Black Mountains of Wales. And there were 6 of us, and we decided to take acid, and we then entered into a real, what I would term a magical dimension. It was not something, and it was, you can call it a collective hallucination if you will, fair enough, but it was a collective hallucination that had bleed through onto so-called reality because there were traces of it left. And like in a magical world, what Sid and I engaged in jousting a bit like knights of yore, and he ended up, in this weird room, and I still see his body, the body of a massive life-size teddy bear with Sid's head on it in the corner of a many-colored acetate. The walls were draped in this sort of acetate satin, and, and there was this sort of toy room in a kind of nursery, and there was this big toy with Sid's head on top of it. And when Sid came down, he wasn't Sid anymore. Part of himself had been left in that magical room. And it was eerie in the remarks that were made. What's the matter with you, Sid? You look like some extraordinary big teddy bear, some girls said. And it was, very startling. And Sid then never recovered. And my feeling, unfortunately, I didn't gather what needed to be done. And I don't think the others would have believed it anyway, but it was sort of like the exterminating angel, Luis Buñuel's film. You needed to put everybody back into the same positions and try to retrieve the missing piece and to restore him to his former self, which of course was never done because we then each traveled into completely different dimensions, and I never saw him again.
Mm.
I was off to India and Nepal and Tibet and all that, and never saw him again.
In a way, when you're doing that, is that the 60s have got too much, and there's got to be another way to get, when you're starting to travel to India, is that a subconscious journey to escape the burnout? Because you've seen people burning out pretty badly in the 60s.
Well, I didn't burn out, but I certainly could see what.
I'm interested in the way you didn't burn out. Yeah.
I didn't burn out, but I saw the possibility of this happening. And it was just before another acid trip was with Keith Richards, my girlfriend Romina, and other people, Tony Kent and so on, at Villa Medici, just before Keith was meant to go back to England to possibly face being sentenced to go to jail. So there was a slightly somber quality to it. And coming down off of that, I saw that my path should be to go the way of the white clouds, as opposed to continuing on a solo career with this other band and so on. And that's what I decided my direction would become. And hence, I managed to tear the ties that bound me to my situation and cast adrift and go on the way of the white clouds, which took me on this very long parable across the whole on a journey to the east that was overland to India and to eventually to through Afghanistan and Persia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and then Nepal, and by way of being in the Kuman Himalayas, etc., etc. So it's and then the return to a defining direction in developing my own previous research into Western esotericism.
Mm-hmm. And is that the path you're still on now?
Well, no, I conduct both. I conduct a kind of a kind of multiple dimensionality. we have numerous right now in this COVID-19 situation. We are we have these meetings of a kind of hermetic salon, which today, Tuesday, in a few hours, we will have a 2.5 hour meeting on Zoom with all the participants across many disciplines, many different fields, over a text by a discussion group on Zoom, over a text by Gary Lachman. Do you know who Gary Lachman is? Gary Lachman was Gary Valentine, who played guitar in Blondie.
Oh, I know him.
He's a very eminent scholar now. He's written many, many books that are utterly fascinating. He's one of the brightest people you could ever meet. I would strongly recommend it. You should contact him and interview him. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy.
I interviewed him 20 years ago. I didn't know he had I didn't know he was called. I didn't know his real name, but I interviewed him 20 years ago. Yeah. So I have met him. Yeah.
Well, Gary's a fascinating character, and his books, for instance, we're now having a discussion group based on the reading of his book called The Secret History of Consciousness. And that implies all kinds of side research and so on. I'm studying a book that he refers to in the chapter we're currently reading, which is this, Julian Jaynes, The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, The Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. Very remarkable work in its own right. And, it leads to all sorts of very interesting walks of the mind, as it were.
So, in a sense, you're still going forward.
Oh, constantly. We're doing a lot of things. We're doing research. I'm part of many different groups that meet virtually like that. That are not New Age type of, none of that New Age nonsense. Much more rigorous type of and original thinkers, and it is fascinating.
And what is the potential resolve of this quest? Where's the journey going?
Well, with one's own writings and one's own sort of artistic pursuits, these things are all contributing factors to producing, to sowing the right seeds in the garden of one's mind.
Mm-hmm. So it's
as opposed to letting it all lie fallow.
So it's interesting, really, if we look in terms of the 60s, where people were seeking a wisdom or seeking a depth or seeking ideas. Most people ended up making lots of money and playing the same songs over and over for decades. But you've actually ended up in the place everyone was kind of aiming at.
Yes, I suppose so, because to a lot of people, like the Beatles got fascinated but got turned off by a kind of tawdriness and a kind of weariness that stemmed from the Maharishi's ambitions, which were, I think the Maharishi was genuinely, on the whole, a good person. But when I met him again in India after everybody had gone, he asked me, "Why have your friends gone?" And I started to try to explain to him about overexposure and the effects of overexposure, how things, if you're overexposed, you kind of go out of fashion, as it were. And there was, to some extent, a fashionable kind of engouement is the French word for it, a kind of falling in love with the idea of it, but the practical reality of of spending time in India, and extremely, people tell you, oh, it was very basic and very, to people now used, like the Beatles used to luxury and would crawled out of poverty into indulgence and luxury. It felt very rough to be there, and there was this stupid idealism we all shared, that people like the Maharishi were practically non-human beings, and they were our psychedelic naivete we attributed to such figures a kind of almost divine quality that should have made them impervious to whatever, and if there was any hint, there was a horrified kind of puritanical reaction to any discoveries of any other intentions. So it made it, and in retrospect, I laugh at all this naivety. I laugh at myself in India with my love of, I fell head over heels into the exoticism of it all. So I was dressed in great yogi robes and all that kind of thing. And there was an element of exoticism, of playing this part, of doing this. And it's one of the pitfalls that one must avoid at all costs, to be when the part that you're playing hurtles you headlong into fantasy rather than into just vision and imagination. Oh, I see. But you're doing something on goth music as well.
Yeah, which starts with the fall of Rome and ends up with now. So it's a long story. But Lord Byron.
John, look up this thing I told you about. Look up Les Incroyables. Because you'll see that there's a visual now with this marvelous thing of the internet used in the right way. It's such a powerful tool because you can see what I mean.
As soon as you mentioned it, I was going to look it up, and it was going to be a footnote in the book, because I do trace a lot of the stuff in goth. I'm tracing back to Lord Byron. I'm tracing back to the Romantic poets. I'm tracing it back to medieval architecture. So it's the whole trip, the whole journey.
Yeah, when about Byron, there's a funny thing that Villa Diodati in Colony above Geneva, at the time when my parents rented it, just at the end of the war, had still on the walls the fabrics that the poet had chosen when he leased the place. He had he had it all dressed up and so on. These fabrics were still there, almost less than 150 years later, but it was 130 years later, and the place was still intact, and my father, who always prized a tenuous family connection to Lord Byron, had a dream of Byron and said, "Oh, I love Don Juan" in the dream at Villa Diodati, and Byron replied in the dream, "Oh, that one I haven't written yet."
Which is a pretty good story.
Yeah. And so, it was an incredible, I just have this enchanted vision still. Of course, I was a little boy then, but, of this whole environment. It was brilliant.
That's fantastic.
And it was intact. After the war, after my parents left, unfortunately, the place was purchased by some other people. And since there was no protection of historical places, they gutted it.
Oh, it's a shame.
And nothing remains of the original except the outside walls of the original structure.
Yeah, and the
All
great.
right, John. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Speak soon then. Yeah. Okay.
Bye. Thank you.